Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling special education in the U.S.
Okay.
Big topic, I know,
Yeah.
but we've got a really interesting source to dig into.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
It's this blog post by Dr. Howie Knoff.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of him.
You know him?
Yeah. He's the president of Project Achieve's Educational Solutions.
Right. Yeah, and he's been a pretty prominent voice in special ed for years.
Yeah, he's been doing this for a while.
So this post is actually marking the 20th anniversary of IDEA.
Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Exactly. That's the big one, the law that really shapes how we do special ed in this country.
Huge impact. Yeah.
And here's where it gets interesting. Knoff doesn't just pat everyone on the back for the last 20 years. He actually calls out some pretty serious challenges that are still out there. And he even gets kind of critical of the Office of Special Education Programs.
OSEP.
OSEP, yeah. So buckle up. This is going to be a deep dive.
Definitely.
So before we get to all the controversy, let's just do a quick IDEA 101.
Right, for folks who might not be super familiar.
Yeah, basically IDEA is all about guaranteeing that every student with a disability has access to what's called a free, appropriate public education.
We all know it as FAPE.
FAPE, exactly.
Right, so that means things like creating an IEP for every student.
Individualized education plan.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So that lays out what their needs are, the services they'll get.
Things like speech therapy, counseling, assistive technology, you name it.
It's about making sure each student has a plan tailored to them.
And a key part of all this is the idea of the least restrictive environment.
You'll often hear that phrase.
Yeah, and it basically means that students with disabilities should be in general education classrooms as much as possible.
Right, not just separated off into their own world.
Right. The goal is to have them learning alongside their peers without disabilities to the fullest extent possible.
Makes sense.
Now, Knox definitely acknowledges that IDEA has had a positive impact overall.
Yeah, you can't argue with that.
He even says there's no denying it's opened doors for countless students.
Tons of kids have benefited.
Absolutely. But he also argues that there are some really significant roadblocks that are preventing the law from truly reaching its full potential.
So it's not all sunshine and roses.
Not exactly. He gets pretty real about the challenges, and he puts the blame on a few key factors.
Like what?
Well, first up, there's the funding issue.
Always a big one.
Always.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the total amount of money being spent. It's also about how that money gets distributed within districts.
Right. Some schools might be getting more than others, even if they don't necessarily have greater needs.
Exactly. And then, of course, you can't talk about education without talking about staffing.
Oh, yeah. The teacher shortage.
It's hitting everyone, but it's especially bad in special ed.
Makes sense.
Knopf points out that there's a huge shortage of certified special ed teachers across the country.
I can imagine it's hard to find qualified people.
And it's not just teachers, it's also specialists like school psychologists.
Right. Those folks are crucial.
Absolutely. And even when schools do manage to hire qualified people, there's often a lack of proper training and supervision.
So they might not be getting the support they need to actually be effective.
Exactly. And all of this kind of points to a bigger issue that Knopf brings up, which is this disconnect between general education and special education.
Okay, so it's not just about resources, it's about how the system is structured.
Right. He argues that these two systems often operate in silos within the same school.
They're not really working together.
Not as well as they should be, which leads to a lack of coordination in the curriculum, the instruction and the support that students get.
Yeah, that's not good for anyone.
Definitely. And Knopf says that this lack of coordination has some really serious consequences for students.
So how does this actually play out?
Well, one example he uses is this idea of misplaced students.
They're misplaced.
Yeah, because a lot of districts don't have a full range of options for what's considered a least restrictive environment.
See?
So some students might end up in settings that aren't really the best fit for their needs.
Like they could be in a more restrictive environment than they need to be.
Exactly. Some kids who could actually thrive in a general ed classroom with the right support might end up stuck in a self-contained classroom.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good.
And then on the flip side, you have students who are placed in general ed classrooms, but they're not getting the support they need to actually succeed.
So they're kind of falling through the cracks.
Right. And then there's the issue of disproportionality.
That's a big one.
Yeah, this is where certain groups of students, and it's often minority students, end up either overrepresented or underrepresented in certain special ed categories.
I've heard about that.
Or they might face harsher disciplinary actions.
Like suspensions or expulsions.
Exactly. And it raises this really important question. Are these disparities actually because of differences in student needs? Or are they more a reflection of biases within the education system itself?
That's a tough question.
And Knopf argues that a big part of this is the lack of what are called Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions.
Okay, so remind me what those are again.
So think of it this way. Tier 1 is the general instruction that every student gets right.
Right, the core curriculum.
Exactly. But when students start to struggle, that's where Tier 2 comes in.
That's for small groups of students who need extra help.
Right. And then if those students still need more support, that's when you move to Tier 3, which is the most individualized level.
Okay, so it's like a pyramid of support.
Exactly. And what Knopf is saying is that without these additional layers of support, students who are struggling are more likely to end up in special ed or facing disciplinary consequences.
So it's almost like we're setting them up to fail.
Yeah, kind of. And it's not just within the classroom that we see these system failures. Knopf also talks about how there's often a lack of coordination between schools and community resources.
Oh, so it's not just about what's happening inside the school building.
Exactly. He highlights the issue of mental health services for students.
Yeah, a lot of kids are struggling with that these days.
Absolutely. And he points to the fact that schools often don't have enough resources to provide adequate mental health support.
So what happens then?
Well, he uses the example of homebound services.
I'm not familiar with that.
It's basically a program where students who can't attend school for medical or mental health reasons can receive instruction at home.
Oh, okay.
But Knopf says that often it's only for a few hours a week, which isn't nearly enough for students with serious mental health needs.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very helpful.
And in some cases, districts might even exclude students entirely because they just don't have the resources to support them.
Wow, it's really sad.
It is. And this lack of coordination also affects students after they graduate.
Oh, so it's not just about the K-12 years.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Knopf points out that a lot of students with disabilities aren't adequately prepared for life after high school.
They might not have the skills they need to be successful.
Exactly. They might not have access to things like vocational training, job coaching, independent living skill, all those things that are crucial for transitioning to adulthood.
So it's like the system isn't just failing them during their school years, it's also failing to prepare them for the future.
Exactly. And that brings us to what's probably Knopf's most controversial argument, which is that the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, is actually part of the problem.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff.
All right, this is where things start to get really interesting.
I am all ears.
Yeah.
So what does he have against OSEP?
Yeah, well, he basically argues that they're stuck in their ways, resistant to change, resistant to new ideas.
Okay, so he's saying they're kind of out of touch.
Yeah, kind of. He even suggests that the same people have been running OSEP for too long, pushing the same agendas.
Interesting.
And he even implies that those agendas might not actually be what's best for students.
Ooh, that's a bold statement.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back, and he specifically calls out some of the frameworks that OSEP promotes, like PBIS.
Positive behavioral interventions and supports.
Right, and also MTSS, multi-tiered system of supports.
I've heard of those.
Yeah, they're pretty popular, but Knopf claims that they haven't really been properly tested or validated before being pushed out to schools.
So he's saying they're not really evidence-based.
Yeah, and he gets pretty harsh about it. He even suggests that some of the people involved in developing these frameworks have admitted that they're basically making it up as they go.
Wow, if that's true, that's pretty concerning.
Yeah, it definitely raises questions about whether OSEP is actually promoting best practices or just kind of pushing agendas without really doing their due diligence.
So it's not just about the frameworks themselves, it's about the process.
Exactly. And then he also takes issue with OSEP's grant funding process.
Oh, yeah, that's always a hot topic.
He claims that there's this network of preferred universities, researchers, nonprofits that always seem to get the lion's share of the funding.
So he's saying there's favoritism going on.
Yeah, and he argues that this just perpetuates the status quo, it stifles innovation because the same people are always getting the money to do the same things.
Makes sense.
And he specifically uses the National PBIS Technical Assistance Center as an example.
Okay, so this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, he points to what he calls glaring research to practice flaws, which basically means that there's a disconnect between the research on PBIS and how it's actually being implemented in schools.
So it's not translating from theory to practice.
Right. And he also criticizes the lack of sustained results.
So even though PBIS is widely used, there's not a lot of evidence to show that it's actually having a lasting impact on things like school safety or student engagement.
And he finds it troubling that the same universities and individuals seem to be getting funding and presenting at conferences year after year.
It does make you wonder if there's a lack of fresh perspectives.
Yeah, and it raises questions about whether OSEP is truly open to diverse approaches.
So Knopf is basically saying that OSEP is too entrenched in its own way of doing things.
That's a good way to put it. And he argues that this is ultimately hurting students because the system isn't adapting to their needs.
It's stagnating.
Exactly. But it's not all doom and gloom. Knopf doesn't just highlight the problems, he also offers solutions.
Okay, so what's his plan?
Well, he lays out this whole next agenda for OSEP, starting with the type of leader he thinks should be in charge.
So he has a specific vision for who should be running the show.
Yeah, he wants someone who embodies what he calls a scientist practitioner model.
What does that mean?
It means someone who has a deep understanding of research, but also practical experience working in schools.
So not just an academic.
Right, someone who's actually been in the trenches, who understands the day-to-day realities of what it's like to work with students with disabilities.
Yeah, makes sense.
And he specifically calls for experience in large, complex districts.
So someone who knows how to navigate a big bureaucracy.
Yeah, someone who understands the challenges and the nuances of working within a large system.
Interesting.
And he also emphasizes the need for expertise in effective school practices that benefit all students, not just those with disabilities.
So it's about creating a more inclusive environment overall.
Exactly. And this is where he introduces this really interesting concept called the ability down perspective.
Ability down? I haven't heard that before.
It's basically a way of reframing how we view students with disabilities.
Instead of focusing on their deficits, we focus on their strengths.
Exactly. Instead of looking at what they can't do, we look at what they can do, and we create learning environments that nurture those abilities.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a really powerful idea. And I think it's a key part of Knopf's vision for a more effective and equitable special education system.
So it's about shifting the focus from limitations to possibilities.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, Knopf wants a leader who is skilled in strategic planning and change management.
Someone who can actually make things happen.
Right. Someone who can take his recommendations and turn them into concrete actions.
Yeah.
Someone who can shake things up at OSEP and really move the needle on these critical issues.
So he's not just calling for a change in mindset, he's calling for a change in leadership.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He believes that the right person at the helm could make all the difference.
Okay, so let's get into those recommendations. What exactly does Knopf's next agenda entail?
Well, it's pretty comprehensive. It's a whole roadmap for overhauling special education in the U.S.
Sounds ambitious.
It is. Some might even say it's radical, but I think it's definitely worth considering.
So what are some of the key points?
Well, one of his central recommendations is to break down the silos between general education and special education.
Yeah, he mentioned that earlier.
Right. He wants to see greater integration of ESA and IDEA.
Elementary and Secondary Education Act.
Exactly. And he envisions mandated collaboration at the district level between general and special education administrators.
So they're working together to create a more unified system.
Exactly. He wants to see a multi-tiered system of support that benefits all students.
So it's not just about special ed anymore. It's about supporting every student who needs help.
Right. The idea is that all students, regardless of whether they have an IEP, might need additional support at some point in their education.
Makes sense.
And he also calls for empowering districts to conduct really thorough special education needs assessments and resource analyses.
So it's about understanding what's working, what's not, and where the gaps are.
Exactly. And then using that data to develop targeted and actionable plans for improvement.
It's about making sure that resources are being used effectively and that programs are actually meeting the needs of students.
Right. But he also recognizes that data collection can be a huge burden on schools. So he recommends streamlining the state performance plan and annual performance report process.
So it's about making the process more efficient and less time-consuming.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between gathering meaningful data and not overwhelming schools with paperwork.
Right.
And then he also calls for a major audit of OSEP's grant funding process.
Yeah, he had some strong opinions about that.
Right. Remember, he accused them of favoritism, of consistently funding the same institutions and individuals.
Right.
So he wants to see a process that's truly fair, objective, and that promotes diversity in the types of frameworks and research approaches that receive support.
So it's about opening up the field to new ideas and new perspectives.
Exactly. And he even suggests investigating potential conflicts of interest within the grant review panels.
Wow, he's not messing around.
He's definitely pushing for greater transparency and accountability within OSEP.
I can see why some people might see him as a troublemaker.
Oh, for sure. But I think he's raising some really important points.
Definitely.
And he doesn't stop there. He also wants to see a review of OSEP's staffing and organizational structure.
Oh, to address that groupthink he was talking about.
Exactly. He questions whether staff longevity has actually hindered progress, and he suggests that new blood might be needed to shake things up a bit.
So he's basically advocating for a shakeup of the entire organization.
Pretty much, yeah. But it's not just about the administrative side of things. He also delves into the workforce that actually supports special education.
Oh, so the teachers and specialists?
Exactly. He calls for a national review of special education recruitment, retention, professional development, and skills.
So it's about making sure we have enough qualified people and that they're getting the support they need to be successful.
Exactly. He wants to analyze the different roles within special education, the effectiveness of training programs, the support needs of these professionals.
And then use that information to make system-wide improvements.
Right. It's about investing in the people who are on the front lines working with students every day.
Yeah, it makes sense that you can't just focus on bringing people in. You have to make sure they're well equipped to do the job.
Exactly. And it's not just about the nuts and bolts of teaching. He also emphasizes the importance of addressing the health, the mental health, the overall well-being of students.
Oh, yeah, it's huge.
He recognizes that a student's well-being plays a big role in their ability to learn and thrive.
Makes sense. If you're not feeling good physically or mentally, it's hard to focus on school.
Right. And this actually connects to his final recommendation, which is a pretty thorough review of programs like Continuum of Care, Wraparound, School-to-Work Transition.
Okay, I've heard of those, but I'm not super familiar with them.
Basically, these programs are designed to provide more comprehensive support for students, especially those with mental or behavioral health needs.
So it's about going beyond just the typical classroom setting.
Right. It's about recognizing that some students need more individualized support.
Yeah, like a wraparound approach.
Exactly. But Knopf argues that even though there's been a lot of investment in these programs, they often fall short.
So they're not as effective as they could be.
Right, and he wants to see a really critical examination of these programs to figure out what's not working and how to fix it.
So it's about identifying the weaknesses and finding solutions.
Exactly. It's about making sure that these programs are actually effective in meeting the needs of students and helping them transition successfully to adulthood.
So it's really about the long game.
Absolutely. It's not just about getting kids through school. It's about preparing them for life after graduation.
Makes sense.
So yeah, that's Knopf's next agenda in a nutshell. It's a pretty bold vision for change.
It's definitely ambitious.
Yeah. Some might even say it's radical, but I think it's definitely worth considering. He's raising some really important questions about the state of special education in this country.
He's definitely a provocateur.
Yeah, but I think that's a good thing. We need people who are willing to challenge the status quo and push for better solutions.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think the first step is to have these conversations, to really dig into the issues that Knopf is raising and figure out what we can do to address them.
Yeah, it's not just about agreeing or disagreeing with him. It's about using his ideas as a springboard for action.
Exactly. And I think it's important for everyone to be a part of this conversation, not just educators and policymakers, but also parents, students, community members.
Right. Everyone has a stake in this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I hope this deep dive has sparked some ideas and maybe even some inspiration.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's so much more to explore when it comes to special education.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
But I think the most important thing is that we're talking about it, that we're trying to find ways to create a system that truly supports all students.
Couldn't agree more.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of special education.
My pleasure.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future for all students.